The last known photograph captured them in a moment of bright, uncomplicated joy. Sarah, with a cascade of hair the color of weak sunlight, leaned into Michael's shoulder, his arm a secure brace around her waist. The background was a blur of emerald green, the endless, looming majesty of the Oregon wilderness. They were 18 and 19, armed with a cheap tent, a map folded countless times, and the kind of boundless, naive optimism that only the very young possess. They had come to the Cascades National Monument not for any grand achievement, but for a simple, quiet escape, a final, cherished breath of freedom before the suffocating pressures of college and adult life began to close in. But the wilderness, as always, has its own silent, indifferent agenda. They left on a Tuesday in late May, a promise to be back by Sunday, a thin thread of hope spun against the vast indifference of the forest. Sunday came, and then Monday, and the sun, once a source of warmth and light, became a grim, relentless clock counting down the hours of their absence. That is where the story truly begins, not with their departure, but with the terrifying, suffocating silence that followed. Their abandoned, rust-colored sedan was eventually found by a forestry patrolman 200 miles north of their intended destination, a baffling detail that shattered the family's initial assumption of a simple, overdue hiking trip. The car sat tilted slightly on a gravel turnout on a seldom-used logging road, deep in the rogue River Siskiyou National Forest. It was a place of oppressive silence, where the towering firs seemed to consume all light and sound. The doors were unlocked, the keys were still in the ignition, and the car's small, cheap radio was tuned to a classical music station, the volume low, a ghostly sound in the sudden quiet of the search team's arrival. This scene was not one of panic. It was one of deliberate, almost calm abandonment. Nothing was stolen. Sarah's worn leather backpack, containing her wallet and ID, was tucked neatly behind the passenger seat. Michael's new digital camera, still holding the cheerful photos of their first 2 days, was resting on the dashboard. The investigators, seasoned professionals who had seen their share of strange disappearances, felt a cold, knot of dread form in their stomachs. This was not a runaway situation. This was not a simple accident. Someone, or something, had caused this young couple to leave their vehicle with an immediate, unquestioning haste, taking nothing but the clothes on their backs. Why would they leave a vehicle that was their lifeline? Why leave their identification and emergency supplies? The initial theory that they were lost after a short walk quickly crumbled under the weight of the evidence, or rather, the lack of evidence. Helicopters were called in, their rotary blades slicing the thick air, a desperate, man-made noise against the ancient silence of the woods. Hundreds of search and rescue volunteers, their brightly colored vests a jarring contrast to the forest floor, combed the surrounding 10-mile radius. They found nothing. No footprints in the soft, rich earth. No discarded candy wrappers. No snapped branches to mark an impromptu trail. It was as if Sarah and Michael had simply dissolved into the air, vanishing without leaving a single trace that could explain their impossible, unnerving departure from the car. The families, their faces etched with a profound and escalating despair, held vigils in the nearby small town, their hope dwindling with every day the sun rose over the indifferent mountains. They could only imagine the fear their children must have felt, the crushing realization of being utterly alone in a landscape that was rapidly becoming their tomb. The gravity of the situation was now absolute. The forest had claimed them, but how and why remained an agonizing, impenetrable mystery. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a narrative pause before the truly devastating chapter was to be written, and the lead investigator, Detective Miller, knew instinctively that the answers they sought were not hidden in the trees, but beneath a darker, more unsettling surface. The unsettling nature of the scene, the keys in the ignition, the untroubled placement of their belongings, suggested a perpetrator who was calm, assured, and perhaps most chillingly, entirely unforeseen by the victims. The investigators were left standing at the precipice of a mystery, staring into the silent maw of the vast, unforgiving wilderness, grasping for a thread that simply did not exist. The early spring gave way to a relentless, punishing summer, and the search officially became a recovery mission. The summer months passed in a blur of fruitless leads and crushing disappointment, each passing week adding another layer of ice to the family's already frozen hearts. The massive public search, once a frenzy of activity, dwindled down to a small, dedicated task force working in grim, quiet desperation. Detective Miller, a man whose career had been a study in human depravity, found himself consumed by the sheer impossibility of this case. He had processed scenes of violence, passion, and desperation, but this one was different. It felt clean, meticulous, and fundamentally wrong. The original theory that the couple had encountered a reclusive, dangerous element in the woods was still the leading hypothesis, but without a struggle, a sign of forced entry, or even a single drop of blood, it felt hollow. The narrative demanded a violent confrontation, but the evidence suggested a peaceful, albeit immediate, acquiescence. The investigation turned inward, shifting its focus from the forest to the digital trail. They meticulously combed through Sarah and Michael's phone records, social media activity, and banking statements. What they found was a portrait of ordinary, contented young adults. No secret debts, no illicit affairs, no sudden, unexplained anxiety. There were a handful of final, cheerful texts sent from a service station just hours before their estimated time of arrival at the car's final location, confirming their plans for the weekend. And then absolute silence. No outgoing calls, no attempted contacts, a void that began exactly at 4:17 p.m. on that Tuesday. This rigid, sudden cutoff was the first truly concrete piece of evidence, a demarcation line between life and a terrifying unknown. It suggested the event was swift, a moment of profound disruption that allowed no time for a final goodbye, no desperate call for help. The search returned to the vehicle, now viewed less as a crime scene and more as a historical artifact, a silent witness to a tragedy they could not yet decipher. Forensic analysts meticulously vacuumed every square inch, focusing on minute details the initial sweep might have missed. They found fragments of a conversation they were not prepared for, an almost imperceptible amount of lake sediment, the kind of fine silt that settles in the bottom of deep, cold water traced onto the fabric of the rear floor mat. It was a microscopic detail, nearly missed, yet was a colossal, impossible clue. The car was found 20 miles from the nearest significant body of water, and the logging road it rested on showed no recent evidence of having been driven through mud or water deep enough to deposit such material. How had deep lake sediment ended up in a car parked cleanly on a dry gravel turnout? This discovery was a violent, narrative wrench, tearing apart every assumption they had painstakingly constructed. If the couple had been near a lake after leaving their car, it meant the entire search perimeter was wrong. It meant the time of death, or at least the time of their final struggle, was indeterminate, and the act of vanishing had been a calculated maneuver, a dark performance designed to misdirect the search. The new lead was geographically devastating. The rogue River Siskiyou National Forest is riddled with hundreds of small, isolated lakes and reservoirs, many of them glacial, deep, and difficult to access. The initial lake silt analysis suggested a deep water environment, cold and oxygen-starved. The question was no longer where they were, but which of the hundreds of possible water graves had been chosen. The families, upon hearing the news, felt a new wave of terror and a terrifying resurgence of hope. A new location meant a new chance, but the dread was now amplified. The image of a forest floor grave was replaced by the terrifying, cold finality of the deep, black water. The summer gave way to autumn, the leaves turning the landscape into a breathtaking canvas of gold and crimson, a beautiful, indifferent stage for the escalating human tragedy. The new search focused on a 50-mile radius that contained several large, man-made reservoirs. The scale of the task was astronomical, but the determination of the small team was now fueled by the chemical certainty of the forensic report. They were looking for the impossible, a vehicle that had somehow been moved, a crime that had been meticulously concealed, and an answer hidden beneath the placid, deceptive surface of a mountain lake. The relentless search for the aqueous connection, driven by a few grains of sediment, led the investigators to the remote and deceptively peaceful shore of Echo Lake, nearly 50 miles southwest of the abandoned sedan. Echo Lake was a former quarry, now a deep, cold, man-made reservoir with steep, rocky banks and an average depth that plummeted to over 100 feet. It was a place of oppressive, natural silence, its dark water reflecting the surrounding forest like a mirror. The area was notorious for its sheer inaccessibility, a challenging environment that spoke of deliberate choice, not random chance. If a criminal wished to dispose of something permanently, this was the kind of place they would select. But the sheer audacity of the crime, driving a car 50 miles from the abduction site, then somehow maneuvering a 20-year-old sedan into such a deep, remote body of water, beggared belief. Detective Miller authorized the use of advanced sonar equipment, a grim, expensive necessity that scanned the lake floor in methodical, frustrating grids. For weeks, the sonar pinged back the shapes of fallen trees, discarded mining equipment, and geological anomalies. The tension on the search boat was a physical thing, a constant, low-frequency hum of dread and expectation. Then, on a frigid October afternoon, the sonar operator saw it, an object of geometric certainty, too regular, too structured to be natural debris. Deep beneath the surface, nestled against a sloping rock face at a depth of 87 feet, was the unmistakable outline of a sedan. The emotional impact of the discovery was immediate and profound. It was not just a car. It was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle, a silent tomb that confirmed their darkest fears. What followed was a complex, slow, and agonizing recovery operation, hindered by the depth, the cold, and the perilous underwater terrain. The sedan was winched up, slowly emerging from the dark water, transformed into a grotesque, silt-covered relic. When the doors were finally pried open on the shore, the narrative that had been woven in whispers and conjecture was violently confirmed. Inside, tragically intertwined, were the remains of Sarah and Michael. The sight was devastating, a stark, somber tableau that extinguished the last flicker of hope the families had harbored. The forensic examination of the vehicle and the bodies was conducted with meticulous, somber reverence. The initial finding was horrifying but perplexing. There were no immediate signs of external trauma, no bullet wounds, no stab marks. The cause of death, pending toxicology, was initially listed as drowning. This detail deepened the mystery, lending credence to the idea that the couple had been incapacitated before the car was submerged, a chilling implication of premeditation and control. The car, however, yielded the first explosive, shattering piece of evidence that moved the case from a missing persons mystery to a deliberate, calculated double homicide. Tucked deep into the seam of the driver's side seat, partially corroded by the lake water, was a small, crudely fashioned arrowhead. It was not a modern hunting tip. It was an obsidian artifact, a piece of pre-contact stone toolcraft, rusted and stained with an impossible combination of lake sediment and what was later confirmed to be minute, degraded traces of human blood. Michael's blood, to be precise. The presence of this ancient, almost ritualistic object in the wreckage of a modern crime was a shocking anomaly. It didn't belong in the car, and it certainly didn't belong at the bottom of a lake. Its existence shattered the clean, simple narrative of an anonymous killer. Why an arrowhead? Why leave such an anachronistic calling card? The narrative had officially taken a dark, unbelievable turn, suggesting a motive and a perpetrator far more complex and unsettling than the investigators had ever imagined. The cold truth of their final hours was beginning to surface, revealing a killer who was not only brutal, but perhaps deeply, disturbingly symbolic in their chosen method of terror and disposal. The search had ended, but the true investigation, the one into the dark, twisted psychology of the killer, was only just beginning, an oppressive weight settling over the small community. The discovery of the obsidian arrowhead was not just an anomaly. It was a psychological inflection point in the investigation, forcing the task force to pivot from a conventional missing persons case to a truly bizarre and disturbing homicide. Detective Miller, now gripped by a sense of righteous urgency, dispatched the artifact to the State Archaeological Laboratory. The experts there confirmed its age and origin, a high-grade obsidian point consistent with tools used by indigenous groups in the region over 600 years ago. Its presence was not accidental. It was a deliberate placement, a dark, symbolic signature. The traces of Michael's blood suggested it had been used, not as the murder weapon itself, but perhaps as an instrument of psychological coercion or a pre-mortem wound, a terrifying act designed to inflict pain and panic. This twisted detail necessitated a deeper look into the region's cultural history, specifically focusing on any local lore, ancient rituals, or modern splinter groups that might hold a distorted reverence for these ancient methods. Simultaneously, the forensic analysis of the bodies provided the second, devastating piece of the narrative. The toxicology reports came back conclusive, revealing high concentrations of a powerful, fast-acting sedative in both Sarah and Michael's systems. They had not been struggling or fighting when the car went into the lake. They had been unconscious or, at the very least, profoundly incapacitated. This explained the baffling calm of the abandoned sedan, the keys in the ignition, the neatly placed backpack. The victims hadn't chosen to leave their car. They had been abducted, rendered inert, and then their own vehicle had been weaponized and transformed into their coffin. This was the work of a highly methodical, terrifyingly deliberate individual. The discovery of the sedative narrowed the profile of the killer. This was not a transient psychopath who stumbled upon a couple. This was someone with access to pharmaceutical-grade drugs, someone with a plan that spanned the initial abduction, the forced sedation, the 50-mile drive to the remote lake, and the meticulous staging of the abandoned vehicle 200 miles away from the initial planned destination. The sheer logistical complexity was staggering, pointing toward a meticulous level of forethought that bespoke a deeply disturbed but highly intelligent predator. But the most crucial piece of physical evidence, the final undeniable clue, was found in the car's trunk, a detail missed during the initial chaos of the recovery. Scratched into the internal latch of the trunk, so faint it required specialized lighting to capture, was a single, cryptic symbol, two intertwined circles, a mark that held no immediate meaning to the investigators. This was the killer's final, silent message, etched into the metal of the tomb. The investigation now split into two desperate lines of inquiry. The first, a massive data-driven hunt for anyone with access to the specific sedative and a connection to the remote region. The second, an anthropological and linguistic deep dive into the meaning of the obsidian arrowhead and the twin circle symbol. The local community, once united in grief, was now consumed by a rising tide of paranoia. Whispers of cults, ancient curses, and reclusive mountain dwellers began to circulate, the very real terror of the crime feeding the region's historical mythology. Detective Miller, however, remained focused on the tangible. The killer was not a ghost or a legend. They were a person, a neighbor, a local who knew the land with an intimacy that allowed for such a flawless, devastating escape. The twin circles, he intuitively believed, were the key, the modern signature that would unlock the archaic terror of the arrowhead. The emotional toll on the families was now compounded by a horrifying intellectual realization. Their children hadn't merely been victims of a random act. They were integral components of a dark, calculated performance, a narrative written in sedatives and symbols, and sealed in the crushing depths of a glacial lake. The search for a person to match the profile of cold, methodical, symbolic violence had begun, a terrifying search for a shadow hidden in plain sight, living among the very people who were now consumed by fear. The meticulous search for the source of the sedative and the meaning of the twin circle symbol eventually converged on a man whose very existence seemed to embody the unsettling contradictions of the case. Elias Vance was a 53-year-old former physician who had abruptly lost his medical license a decade earlier due to what were officially termed unorthodox and experimental treatments. After his fall from grace, he had retreated into a reclusive life in a secluded, self-built cabin near the edge of the rogue River Siskiyou forest, becoming a local eccentric, known for his obsession with regional history and his unnerving self-sufficiency. Vance had the perfect profile: the medical knowledge to source and administer the specific sedative, the intimate knowledge of the remote terrain to select the final resting place, and the isolation to execute the crime without immediate suspicion. He was a shadow figure, a man who had intentionally erased his digital footprint. But the true, horrifying breakthrough came from the anthropological research into the cryptic symbols. An expert in Pacific Northwest indigenous iconography identified the twin circles. It was not a common symbol, but it was known in certain academic circles as an ancient, highly specific marker related to a pre-contact concept of the double bind, a symbolic representation of a state where a person is trapped between two opposing, unavoidable forces, often associated with a ritualistic belief that one life must be sacrificed to balance a natural imbalance. This deeply symbolic, almost cult-like connection, coupled with the obsidian arrowhead, suddenly gave the entire crime a terrifying new context. It wasn't just murder. It was a deeply personal, symbolic act of control and warped belief. The investigators finally had their lens, their filter through which to view the suspect's life. A warrant was executed on Elias Vance's cabin. The scene inside was not one of squalor or madness, but of meticulous, frightening order. The cabin was a museum of his twisted obsessions, shelves lined with archaic medical texts, geological survey maps annotated with cryptic markings, and glass cases filled with expertly crafted obsidian tools and arrowheads. It was the lair of an intellectual predator. The final, damning evidence was found in a locked, lead-lined trunk hidden beneath the floorboards. Inside, alongside a small, unmarked vial of the exact sedative used on Sarah and Michael, was a large, spiral-bound journal. The journal was Vance's manifesto, a chilling, first-person narrative that detailed the planning and execution of the crime with clinical, emotionless precision. It confirmed everything. The abduction had been random, a couple chosen only for their youth and their presence in his self-proclaimed territory. The journal described the use of the sedative, the journey to the lake, and the deliberate placement of the arrowhead. A ritualistic act, he wrote, to symbolically bind their spirits to the earth and water. He saw the act not as murder, but as a necessary rebalancing of the ecological and spiritual debt he believed humanity owed to the land. The prose was terrifyingly calm, recounting the horrific act with the detached tone of a scientist recording an experiment. Vance's capture, which occurred 20 miles away at a remote logging supply store where he was calmly purchasing provisions, brought a sudden, shocking end to the active investigation. But the narrative of the crime itself, the story of those missing months, was finally being written in full, devastating detail. Vance's interrogation, a tense, psychologically draining affair, yielded a monologue, not a confession. He never apologized. He merely explained his actions through the warped lens of his self-created belief system, calmly detailing how he had driven the sedan into the lake using a long, pre-attached cable, securing the steering wheel before releasing the brake and allowing the vehicle to roll, its young occupants already silenced by the drug. The sense of closure was immense, but the tragedy was profound. Sarah and Michael were not just victims. They were the unfortunate focal point of a deeply intelligent man's descent into a symbolic madness, their final moments stripped away by a chilling cocktail of pharmaceutical control and archaic ritual. The evidence now presented an undeniable truth. The vast, silent wilderness had not claimed them by accident. It had merely provided the backdrop for a symbolic, methodical act of human terror orchestrated by a killer hiding in plain sight. The final act of this tragedy unfolded not in the silent forest, but in the sterile, brightly lit confines of the courtroom. The trial of Elias Vance became a media spectacle, a national conversation piece that pitted the meticulous clarity of forensic science against the unsettling complexity of a symbolic, premeditated madness. The prosecution's case was built upon the relentless accumulation of physical and written evidence. The lake sediment, the specialized sedative, the journal, and, most powerfully, the chilling anachronism of the obsidian arrowhead and the twin circle symbol. The narrative presented was one of cold, calculated evil, a deliberate act that weaponized a man's superior intellect and his intimate knowledge of the wild to eliminate two young, innocent lives. Vance, representing himself with a chilling, self-assured arrogance, did not deny the facts of the case. Instead, he attempted to elevate his crime to a philosophical or ritualistic act, reading lengthy, rambling passages from his journal to the court, attempting to justify the double homicide as a necessary corrective. He spoke of the double bind not as a trap, but as a path to purification, positioning himself as a tragic steward of the desecrated land. His voice, once a source of medical comfort, now dripped with an unsettling, intellectualized disdain for human law, creating an unnerving atmosphere in the courtroom where the gravity of the crime clashed with the absurdity of his defense. The families of Sarah and Michael sat through every agonizing detail, their presence a silent, unwavering testament to the human cost of Vance's grand, dark experiment. They heard the detached account of their children being sedated, driven 50 miles in their own car, and then, without struggle, consigned to the black, crushing pressure of 87 feet of water. The detail that seemed to cause the most profound grief was the revelation that, according to the journal, Vance had watched the air bubbles cease rising from the sinking sedan, a patient, clinical observer of his own monstrous creation. Detective Miller, now a key witness, presented the linear timeline of the investigation, drawing a clear, undeniable line from the quiet, staged abandonment of the sedan to the ritualistic symbol scratched into the submerged trunk latch. His testimony methodically stripped away the killer's self-created mythology, reducing the symbolic acts to mere tools of concealment and control. The arrowhead, the twin circles, the remoteness of the site, all were exposed as deliberate misdirection, designed to confuse the investigation and by the killer time to retreat back into the comfortable anonymity of his reclusive life. The jury, after a surprisingly short deliberation, found Elias Vance guilty on all counts of first-degree murder, a swift and just verdict that offered a legal finality, but no true solace. Vance received 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Yet, even as he was led away, his eyes held an unnerving glint of self-justification, a terrifying suggestion that the double bind narrative was complete only in his mind. The final closure came not from the verdict, but from the process of understanding. The case of Sarah and Michael had been a chilling study in contrast, youthful optimism consumed by archaic malice, the vast, silent beauty of the wilderness concealing a precise, claustrophobic act of human terror. Their story remains a somber, cautionary tale of the shadows that can lurk behind the facade of normalcy, and the immense, dedicated effort required to pull a dark, terrifying truth from the depths of a remote mountain lake, forcing the ancient and the modern to confront each other in a devastating narrative of loss and calculated cruelty. The silence of the forest was broken, and the dark truth was finally revealed, but the scar on the community and on the hearts of the families would remain a permanent, aching testament to the profound injustice of their final, tragic journey.